Thank you. Toby, that was fantastic. So because I have so many things to say, I'm going to try to race through the material so we can actually have a chat as well. I wanted to go back to history. It's important to go back to history in order to think about why values of open source still matter today, especially in the context of all the changes we're seeing, AI and other challenges, right? So we still need to say, why does open source matter? The second reason is there's been such a huge influx of new folks into open source, new industries, new young people from college, et cetera, that I think it's important for us to go back and say, what are the values of open source? Why did we do what we did? And how do we protect these values and evolve these values as we encounter new things? So I'll talk in 4 parts. The first part is revolution. Why did open source come into being? Second part, the bedrock of the internet, the age of AI, and then why open source matters. Revolution. So back in the day, a lot of us may not remember, but some of us may, more than 30 years ago, it used to be that we actually could not see the source code. We could not change it. We had to be beholden to one company or one producer for any changes to be made, any hardware to be supported. We waited for their roadmap to be published, et cetera, et cetera. So we were really, the pace of innovation was slow. You were really dependent upon one company. And that's what caused the frustration, if you will, in the early days of open source for people like Richard Stallman to say, hey, this is not working for me. My hardware is not supported. I don't have access to the code. I don't have any of the freedoms I as a user need to have. And so you see Richard creating the GPL license, which then allowed him to create the 4 freedoms of software that we all come to realize and rely on. Freedom to examine the code, actually read it in human readable format, the opportunity to change the code, modify it for our use case, add our devices, et cetera, and the ability to have no restrictions in terms of distribution of the code and to use it for any purpose that we want. I remember the days of licensing when I could only use it on a server, and I could only use it here, and I had to count the number of servers that had that software and true it up every quarter and pay my fees. So Richard really changed everything in terms of turning the copyright law on its head and saying it's really about freedoms. And in the early days of open source, to me, it was ideological, it was enthusiastic, it was hobbyist mainly, and it was often considered by industry as fringe. Oh, those hippies, on the side working on open source. And then Act 2 is the beginning of the internet and the growth around open source and Linux. It was a rich, rich time. I think, oops, sorry, it's jumping on me. Okay, there we go. One of the important decisions that was made, I think, in the early days was Linus Torvalds deciding to use a copyleft license, GPL, to release his kernel, the code for his micro kernel, and to say, hey guys, do any of you, or hey gals, do any of you want to get involved and contribute to this code? I don't think I have all the answers. Please get involved. And boy, did they get involved. And here we are, many, many years later, with Linux practically running every digital device out there. The OSI, Open Source Initiative, was also founded about this time, kind of late 90s. And this was by Bruce Perens, who you got to hear this morning. And Bruce's thought was, we need an independent nonprofit who can really think about, what the open source definition is, protect the definition, ensure that the freedoms are protected, and really verify that licenses verified by the OSI meet the needs of these 4 freedoms. And the reason I bring these up, and OSDL was Open Source Development Labs. It was another initiative started by a number of companies. I think IBM may have been involved, Jeff. And it was to say, how can we make Linux and open source ready for the enterprise? How can we make it safe? How can we make it enterprise grade from a security, production, et cetera, perspective? The reason I mention this is all of these institutions and all of these milestones added to making open source really broadly adoptable, broadly usable by the industries and by the internet. The term open source by Christina Peterson was also created at this time. Christine Peterson, a lot of us corporate types were saying, oh my gosh, free. That says that I have to give it away. That seems too kumbaya and too hippie for me. So I want something that is palatable from a corporate perspective. And I think open source was invented at that time, the term open source. And then you kind of see more mature institutions coming into being, like the Apache Foundation, and then the Linux Foundation. The Apache Foundation really came into being to protect the server, the web server, Tomcat, and so also the HTTP server, et cetera, so that it would be in a neutral place and it would be there as a common asset for the world to use. And the Linux Foundation was also created to be a home for Linus Torvalds, so that there's a neutral place where Linus can be, and for collaboration to happen, across companies. The Linux Foundation focuses more on corporate level collaboration. And companies in the past, if you all remember, had to sign agreements and partner agreements and huge amount of friction in order to work with each other. And you had now joining a foundation could help you do frictionless collaboration and computing. Companies that competed with each other, were rivals, came together and said, there's common areas that we can all work on, that we all benefit from, and then we also have areas where we can compete and we can add value, and that was the goal. And you start seeing early tech companies like IBM, Sun, SGI, where I worked, HP, starting to kind of ship Linux-based servers and actually have a Linux-based business. And you had the IPO of Red Hat and VA Linux, which were really exciting in those days. I started working in open source in '98, so it's been my 25th year of working in open source. I know I look young, but it's 25 years. I was a child, and this was a fantastic, giddy time, in '98, 2000, where we were just discovering what is Linux? How does the open source community work? How do we work there? And so IBM had this very clever campaign where they had peace, love, and Linux plastered all over San Francisco. They got a big fine from the city of San Francisco for vandalizing, but they really got the word out. So it was a heady time. So all this then laid the foundation for the coming of big companies like Google and Meta and Amazon and Netflix. And these are companies that found the environment ripe for building web-scale, data-scale, data structures and data centers, and just because you had cheap Intel-based servers running Linux, you could buy thousands and thousands of these. You had the LAMP stack. You had so many maturing open source technologies that you could harness and build together, right? So you could finally, the perfect storm of components coming together to build massive systems, massive web-based businesses, massive cloud-based businesses, et cetera. And they also put out a lot of great at-scale innovation back into open source, which now created kind of the bedrock for the cloud. Think Kubernetes, think Hadoop, think so many wonderful, wonderful assets that came out of these companies. which then led to massive innovation on the cloud side, cloud native, and clouds depending upon open source, and clouds really being built on open source. I will readily say that as a company, we know how indebted we are to open source. We could not build what we have without open source. So from the days, back in the day of our working with Zen and Linux and so many other dependencies, cloud really relies on open source innovation. And then you find that because digital is the way of the future, in the 2000s, if you were a company in any business, software, hardware, et cetera, you could not do without being digital. You had to be a software business. So you had to work in software in order to be successful. And you find that enterprises start leveraging open source. You find my old company, Comcast, saying we are a software company, and actually working in open source and hiring developers and marketing that we are in software and we are innovative. So what does all this lead to? There were also a lot of challenges during this whole time frame. You find that we faced a lot of headwinds as an open source community. Security exploits started gaining a lot of attention. SolarWinds and Heartbleed and Log4j and so on and so forth. And so suddenly the spotlight was on open source, and the governments and everybody else said, oh my gosh, here we are depending upon this sole maintainer in Nebraska who's maintaining this incredibly important component that supports the entire internet. And who's taking care of this security? Who's responsible in the supply chain, right? Is it the maintainer? Is it the foundation? Is it the company? Then you also start seeing a lot of license changes happening. And this started happening, back in 2005, 6. It's because companies who started, new companies based on open source struggled to monetize. And they said, how do I monetize if I'm giving it away? And license changes were seen as, I can block, competition and make sure that, I can continue to harvest the market and I continue to benefit from what's happening in the market. But I don't know if license changes is the way to solve a business model problem or a value problem, right? It's about delivering value and finding the value line where you deliver that you create a successful business model. And then we start seeing new technologies. And I think we've struggled as a community around how do we extend open source licenses to hardware? How do we extend it to data? How do we extend it now to AI? And does it make sense in the AI context? And boy, AI is complex, to say the least. So we go into the Act 3, the dawn of AI. It should be the slow dawn of AI, because AI has been evolving since the 40s and 50s. Machine learning and algorithmic thinking has been happening for a long time. And suddenly it just burst into our consciousness last year with things like ChatGPT, because it was front and center to the consumer. And all of a sudden, the consumer was seeing what AI could be. And then you saw doomsday scenarios of, oh, AI is going to destroy the world, to AI is going to save the world. And so everything in between. And then you started seeing mostly proprietary companies dominate the field of AI. And those who were working in open source AI really didn't have a clear definition of what they were doing. They would slap on an Apache 2.0 license and release the model. But it wasn't clear for us as a community, what does open mean in AI? And I think you heard a lot of very eloquent speakers speak about the different components. So I'll just add to that. Unlike software, where we had to think about copyright, and it was an easy construct to think about, and then we had to think about license and how do I make the copyrights available to customers or to users. Now you have data what license should I use for that? Or is license the right construct? What does open mean in the context of data? Do I just share the metadata? Do I share the data? Do I share where it came from, how I groomed it, what I did with it? Then there's software. There's usually Python code. Then there are models, which are really magical creatures of algorithms and vectors and data and numbers. And then you have weights, which are the formula that was used to kind of train the model. And then you have queries. So you have lots of different components, different creatures, none of them kind of just fall in, except for software, neatly into copyright. So now open source people have to think differently about how they approach what open means. I heard a very good definition. Open means that access is open and it's transparent. So access means there are no restrictions on the license. I can use it for anything, anywhere, any size company, I should be able to use it. And then transparency means I can see the data, I understand the model and how it works. It's not this magical creature. I can play with the weights. I can actually do something with this model. I can modify it and use it, and move forward. But it's not settled yet. OSI and others are working on this, and so I will have a call to action for all of you. There's also other consideration in AI. It's not just the fact that it's made up of all these different components. You also have to factor in, what does fair use of data mean? Can I use it, or do I have to license the data? And what if I can't afford to license the data? Only the big guys can afford to license the data, right? And store the data and get access to compute, and so on and so forth. Then there's bias. We all know, especially AI that's used to make decisions for funding, for incarcerating people or hiring, can be so biased based on the algorithm that's used. And so the people who create the algorithms should also be inclusive and should be a broad set of people. So we actually represent all people in these algorithms. I learned a new thing in FOSDEM last week, which is almost 86% of the language used in AI is English, mostly American English, and about 14% is the rest of the world. So many cultures can get disaggregated by AI, and recipes and language. Someone was searching for beef bourguignon in AI in ChatGPT, and it came up with a Julia Child recipe. Julia Child was an American who taught French cooking in America, but she wasn't the creator of beef bourguignon. There are a lot of French chefs who did this. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into how do we make it more inclusive, how do we make it broader, and open source has always been good about giving and reducing barriers to entry and making it more inclusive and pulling people on. There's also a lot of talk around responsible AI and security, privacy regulations, security and privacy. So there are more considerations than just the different components. And boy, AI and open source is in the spotlight from a regulations perspective. So there's the European AI Act, there's the Executive Order 13960 from President Biden, there's the Bletchley Declaration in the UK. There's a lot of sorting out to do, whilst also building AI models and moving forward. So we're building the plane and we're flying the plane at the same time. And then there are community norms around should I or should I not use code generated from an AI system? Should I accept an abstract coming from an AI system? We get a lot of abstracts now as moderators in conferences coming out of the AI systems. So Act 4, why does open source matter? I think open source has always succeeded in making things more collaborative, more accessible, more cost-effective. That long tail of hardware often is supported because the source code is open, so I, as a device manufacturer can add my device to it. Imagine it'll also reduce the cost of compute. You don't need to work on certain types of GPU in order to get compute cycles to do your training. And open source is already a very critical part of the development life cycle of AI. Everything from Jupyter notebooks to tools like TensorFlow and languages like Python and R. There's a lot of open source, but it's not quite in an LLM or in certain critical areas. And there are a lot of good discussions happening on why we need to maintain open source in AI, but it needs to continue and speed up. I think there's so much at stake. There's more at stake with AI than ever for open. Transparency is extremely important from a bias perspective, from a fairness and justice, et cetera, perspective. I think we need a broad set of users working in the open source ecosystem more than ever. Cost effectiveness is more important than ever. Compute costs and access to data costs cut out a lot of people, and we need that to go down. Diversity of builders matters, as we talked about from a bias perspective, and representing globally the people of the world and their languages and culture is so important. So I urge you to get involved, whether it's at OSI or LFAI and Data or OpenUK. I love the manifest that you have. Get involved. Become opinionated about OpenAI, and not the company, but open source AI, and help make this a more successful open source ecosystem for AI. Thank you so much.